Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that we can move through our pain to find the healthy relationships we want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find the podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Hello and welcome back to A Date with Darkness podcast. I'm so happy to be chatting with you here today. And I have a really special guest lined up for you today. And the guest is Dr. Ajita Robinson. She is coming on today to talk to us about grief in our relationships. And I think this is a much needed topic to discuss because oftentimes when we're in relationships that are hurtful, abusive, or we're no longer connected with a person, we don't acknowledge the grief that comes up around that. People assume that we're supposed to kind of move on. And she talks about, just errors in our thinking around this and what we should be doing. So without further ado, here's Dr. Ajita Robinson. Hello and welcome to the show, Dr. Ajita. How are you?
I'm well, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Nah, I'm looking forward to it. So I know that we've kind of gone back and forth, and I'm excited to have you on. And I think you have a lot of useful information for the listeners. So for the people who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, what's the passion driving your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a licensed clinical professional counselor professionally. I specialize in grief and trauma. I work specifically with first-generation trauma survivors and poverty disruptors, who right now are almost exclusively Black women doctors, so PhDs, JDs, MDs, you name MDivs, who really are just navigating life, right, as the first who is not transmitting or trauma to the next generation, or being very intentional about that. And so really working with individuals who are navigating healing around childhood wounds that have just followed them into adulthood. And when I'm not doing that, I serve as an income strategist for mental health entrepreneurs. And so I really have a passion for creating helping mental health professionals kind of leverage their skills and knowledge to have impact on the community while being able to generate sustainable income, right? And so I like to kind of think about the intersection of what I do across the board is where legacy building meets wealth and wellness, right? And so I think that kind of captures a lot of it. And the kind of why do I do it? I think from a clinical perspective, I became kind of who I needed, right? As a young girl, as an adult survivor of childhood trauma, that piece just showed up, right? And then as someone who left a career in corporate, making Fortune 500 companies a lot of money, I really wanted to be able to help mental health professionals do that in a real way.
Okay, so you left a Fortune 500 companies to become a counselor.
Yes.
One would ask, what made you make that shift?
So actually, I ran from being a counselor. I ran specifically from being a grief therapist. And part of it was, I had spent the first half of my life, growing up in poverty, or kind of just, I think we were solidly middle class, but there was a lot of us, right? And so just not having everything that we needed, but not more than, right? And so I went into, I did this background in business and psychology because I was like, well, I have this passion for helping and healing, but I also need stability, right? And security. And so I utilized my career in corporate to actually pay for my master's degree. And then after that, they kept sticking me in placements with kids, and I was like, I keep telling you that I don't like children. Like, I do not want to work with kids, but all of my clinical experience was in schools and hospitals, K through 12, and I was like, what? Like, no. And so because of that, I was like, I don't want to do this, right? But I was volunteering at an organization that worked with It's called the Center for Women in Transition, and they specialized in nonviolent female offenders when they were reentering. And so I began working with their children while their parents were incarcerated, while the mother primarily was incarcerated. And then I began to do reunification once the mom was within 6 months of release, right? And so that really kind of kept me engaged. And I was like, I really like working with the parents, right? With these women,
Sure.
because they had such rich experiences, right? And part of the reason that they were incarcerated to begin with was trying to provide for their kids. And so that really kind of helped cue me into the trauma piece, but I still wasn't ready to be like, to actually do therapy full time. So I went to law school. So that experience really kind of taught me or reminded me that these women, these, individuals do not receive adequate representation, because many of these mothers should have received, parent skills training, they should have received jobs training, they should have received substance use training, right? Instead, they were incarcerated. And so I thought perhaps this is one way that I can kind of serve and advocate. So I realized about a year and a half into my law program that I was that by the time these women or people in general, right, enter the criminal justice system, it probably was too late, right? Because there were systemic issues there that would really prevent them from actually receiving the adequate support and care that they needed. But a common feature with every single one of these women was trauma, right? We know that's also true with many of our urban African American youth, which is where my substantive area of expertise lies. And so I'm like, fine, let me go back and get some additional trauma training. And so I actually used all of my electives in the law program over in the counseling program. And so I took all of my electives over there, and I ended up finishing the postmasters in grief and loss. And it just opened a door for me where I became really aware that part of the reason that I was so uncomfortable doing work with children was because I hadn't grieved my own childhood wounds. I hadn't grieved my own childhood trauma. So I couldn't sit with kids and bear witness to theirs because I didn't have words. I didn't have words for my experience.
Yes.
And I hadn't done the work in a way that allowed me to create that space for others. And so once I did that, it became very clear where I actually was supposed to be, where God was actually calling me to be. And that knowledge and that work just made the work so much easier. And so I transferred to the PhD program in counseling and have been just super clear ever since then. Like everything that felt like a stretch or that felt like I was forcing myself to be in certain spaces and to use things that I was good at that I was not exactly passionate about came together once I was able to do that work and just embrace that. I could do some preventative work, right? I could do some work that actually changed the trajectory for many of these kids, and that I could have a impact, right, in a different way on the quality of their life and their kids' life, right? If we could actually disrupt the transmission of trauma, right? Disrupt that component, because that was one of the single biggest indicators or predictors of entering the criminal justice system or encountering that system to begin with. And so that's kind of how I got here, which was really is a full circle moment because my mother was incarcerated while I was a child, right? And so none of that like came together for me like on my own. I needed to kind of, I'm a guide girl. And so I know that I got placed in these different, settings and even from my career in corporate, I've been able to leverage all of it in what I do now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel thankful, on the back end. At the time, I was like, why do you keep doing this to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is no one looking at my form where I'm writing my preferences? I want to work with adults. And they sent me to a kindergarten. I was like, what? But now that gives me, it was preparation for what I do now.
Right. And so I did not know that your mother was incarcerated. So that's amazing to hear that, your own experiences certainly shaped your expertise and what you're doing now in terms of your professional work. And then I know that you've shared a lot about how, your grandfather was the inspiration behind your grief work, or specifically the loss of your grandfather was the inspiration behind your grief work. And as a result of that, like you've done a lot of work around grief. Specifically, you recently wrote a book about grief. And I definitely want to talk a little bit about that because, as you know, my podcast is on narcissism, hurtful, abusive relationships,
Mhm.
and trauma. And you spoke to some of that, some of the elements which would apply to that in terms of grief. But one of the things that before we go into that, I definitely want to speak to the piece that you're talking about where you grow up in an oppressive environment, or you grow up, maybe in a violent home. And I'm not saying that yours was, but I know you kind of spoke to some of that in your book, where you grew up in oppressive and maybe violence, specifically African Americans, and how there's a grieving part uh, to that no one really acknowledges. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, and so part of being Black in this country can be very traumatic, right? It can be very um, we encounter disenfranchised grief, which is when the griever is not acknowledged as having lost something, right? And so as Black people, we often experience symbolic loss, loss of safety, which can be physical as well, right? Loss of an identity that's honored, right? Loss of our culture, even um, loss of opportunity, loss of income. We know that even when we are equally qualified, we are generally paid less, right? And so all of those pieces, those are losses that we very rarely have an opportunity or language to name, right? Which means that they go unresolved. They don't get grieved. We don't. What happens is that we internalize all of those experiences, and we receive this programming at a very young age. Like many of us have heard from somewhere that we have to work harder just to be perceived as equal, right? And so that really promotes this habit, this internalized narrative around hyperproductivity, which is a trauma response for many of us, right? And so we constantly attach our worth and our value to what we're being paid, but that actually doesn't work for us because we're significantly underpaid, right? And so we keep this loop of feeling inferior, feeling, struggling with imposter syndrome. It shows up for therapists as not really being able to have money conversations, right? And because we've internalized them with our worth, then we're not really able to adequately charge for our services, right? And have a really hard time with collecting money and having money when we are able to break through that and generate it. There's a lot of guilt that just shows up, and then particularly for those of us who are first gen, I call us trauma and poverty disruptors, right? And so we have exceeded whatever milestones our families of origin were able to kind of reach, like far and beyond, right? And so we often don't have an opportunity or language to grieve the fact that there are a lot of things that we gave up on that trajectory, right? I'm the first in any generation to have a doctorate, right? I'm the first in any generation on either side of my family to have a successful business, which is different than running a business that isn't profitable. And that's no shade. It's just the reality of what often happens for small business owners that is doubly complex when you're a minority owned business, right? And so all of those things came with a lot of mistakes, right? That what I didn't know that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And you incur those expenses across time that, our counterparts in many cases might have access to resources, knowledge, people, someone that's done it before them. So they're not just kind of out there waiting in the middle of the water with no
Mm-hmm.
life raft, right? And so we never get to a place where, well, we might arrive in a place in our life where we are no longer in survival mode, but nothing in that process taught us how to thrive because we've, right?
Yeah.
And talking about thriving often makes us feel guilty about the people we've left behind. And so there's so much that just
Mm.
shows up there, right? In addition to, we haven't even talked about the cumulative trauma that we experience as a community of people in this country, and that weighs on us as well. And we can often feel disconnected from some of those issues
Yes.
because we aren't navigating the day-to-day struggle, but that doesn't mean that we're exempt from some of the racial trauma that we're experiencing, right? The cumulative and collective trauma that we're navigating. All of that plays a part here, that rarely gets named, right? And to some degree, that is adaptive, because if we actually sat with all of the loss, we would be just over activated and flooded with the reality of the situation. And so we do this kind of low grade daily dissociation from the reality. Otherwise, we would like literally be in pain all the time.
Yes.
And so I think that's such a part of our lived experience, that although we understand other people have it, because we don't talk about it, it doesn't get kind of normalized as a part of an experience that's not just happening to me, right? And so I see that a lot in anytime I speak and I'm in community and I'm able to kind of engage with the people who show up, as well as in the work that we do in my practice. Like, it is such a pervasive issue that helping clients name that has been such a freeing experience and such a gift to be able to bear witness to, because now they don't feel like they're being gaslighted, right? Or being gaslit by their lived experience, right? And the societal messages that says you need to just grab yourself up by your bootstraps and keep moving. We dishonor ourselves, right, in that process.
Awesome. I'm glad that you broke that down. And can you share a little bit about how that does show up? I know you spoke about the disconnection, and the imposter syndrome, but are there some other ways in which, a marginalized community can show that they're grieving and not necessarily be attuned to to the feelings that they're having, but outwardly express that in a way that you would be able to pick up on?
Yeah, and so a lot of the things that we do in the face of trauma and in the face of grief looks maladaptive, right? It looks very maladaptive when we take it out of the context in which those behaviors, those coping strategies were developed. And so we see this a lot with kids, right? We see it with the way that they seek attention and attachment. And a lot of it looks like acting out behaviors, right? Adults do the same thing, but it looks different in adults, right? It might be, the way that they communicate their needs, and it feels very aggressive, right? The way that they utilize food and other substances as a coping mechanism, right? So those are often numbing agents from whatever the thing is that we're like feeling in our body. We often see it even in the book, I break it down from like cognitive, behavioral, emotional, all of those different aspects, because they're all affected, right? I talk about grief, trauma being a full body experience. And so we see it a lot in African American, I'll talk about African American women. It certainly happens in men as well. Just where we hold the trauma in our body, we're more likely to have fat pockets like stored in our thighs, right? And it's become synonymous with our shape, but a lot of that is trauma in the body, right? We know that from a physiological perspective, we have higher levels of cortisol, which is our stress, right? It is an indicator of stress. And so that means that we're constantly in a state of activation. What this looks like, because obviously we can't see the physiology of it, right? Just looking at them. But what it looks like is that they have a startle reflex, right? They're constantly on edge. You see it in how rigid their posture might be. It looks like they're on guard, and they are, right? So imagine being on guard all the time, your muscles being activated to maintain that posture of self-protection. When something actually happens, your body's desensitized to the actual harm, right? Or the actual threat of harm, because you're always in an activated state. This means that when we need our fight or flight, that autonomic nervous system to kick on, because it has been at an elevated stage, our body's ability to respond to the real trauma is diminished. It's the reason that when we see something traumatic happening, look at the reaction of Black people, we're like, well, this is normative, right? And they don't code it as trauma because it's a part of the day-to-day experience. The body doesn't physically react because it's already inundated with that level of activation, which can be very unsafe for us in many ways if the body's not registering that we're not safe because we're always activated and elevated. That contributes to a lot of the disproportionates and disparities in health, right? So this contributes to heart conditions, respiratory issues, obesity, right? Us being sick, with the flu and cold, all of those things compromise your ability to fight off these things because you're keeping it in such an activated state. And we're not doing it voluntarily.
Yes.
The body is geared towards self-preservation.
Yes.
And this is one of the things that I try to explain to people when they are, what they think they're passively watching or reading potentially violent content, right? On social media in particular, those videos that we see, the articles that we consume in an effort to bear witness to the truth of what's happening to folks in our community, that we put ourselves at risk for the vicarious trauma.
Sure.
And the thing is the body doesn't know the difference. The body doesn't know that you are physically safe when you are consuming traumatic and violent material.
Yes.
And so it does the same thing that it needs to do by activating that system, right? To keep you safe. Even though you're sitting at home in your bed scrolling social media, the body's like, gear up, right? And so these are the things that kind of happen on a cumulative level, that really compromise our overall sense of self, that complicates our grieving process, because we're not just grieving the physical losses, we're grieving all of the symbolic losses that we've kind of been talking about
Yes.
here.
Yes. And thank you for that in-depth explanation. I so appreciate that. I do want to shift gears for a little bit, because one of the questions that I'm dying to know the answer to is, we brought up the toxic relationships, whether that be, with an unhealthy parent. Maybe it's a parent that you haven't had a relationship with years and they pass away, or maybe it could be an abusive partner or an abusive ex that maybe passed away or is gone, or, they've been gone for a while, like they're just no longer a part of your life. Maybe they've moved on with someone else, or maybe you just don't talk to them. Can you share about that grief and why do people grieve for people that they have let go, like in their mind, they have let them go? And maybe they are at peace with letting them go. And then out of nowhere, boom, something happens,
That's right.
and brings it all
And
back.
so we grieve the loss of connection, right? We grieve loss of relationships. We grieve the gap between what we receive versus what we desired or what we needed. And this happens whether we're talking about a partner, a friend, a parent, right? Because that we are relational beings at our core. And so when it comes to, let's say, a parent that either isn't available emotionally or is abusive or has died, we not only grieve the loss of the relationship that we had, but we also grieve the loss of the relationship that we hoped we might be able to have.
Sure.
And so even when we cut people off and we set those boundaries, we do them for self-protection and we do them to create some peace for ourselves. But generally in the back of our mind, even when the person was abusive, right? Because of the role that they have in our life or the significance of that role in our life, we still have a part of us that hopes at some point they might be, or we might become, or the relationship might evolve in a way that actually meets the need. And so what happens when we don't have, even when we don't have a relationship, let's say with our mother or the one that we
Sure.
need, we seek that mothering relationship in other places, right? The same way we seek that fathering relationship often in our partners. If we have we seek those needs right elsewhere, and so the need either goes unmet or we try and fill it in some way, but it doesn't ever replace the desire that we have for that need to be met from the primary source. And so this is one of the things that is so important for people who have lost a parent, right?
Yeah.
Let's say they lost them in childhood, to still grieve them throughout their life, because that role doesn't actually leave. I always say that even though death does not end a relationship, it ends their physical presence, right? And so the gift in that, find a way to keep that connection and that relationship post their loss, right? The challenge when people are still living is that we aren't really able to finalize that the relationship that we desire is never possible, right? We have to let go of all hope, which at our core, we still hold on to it, even when it's not realistic, when we don't have proof that substantiates that. because that's who we are as individuals, right? That's who we are as people. And we have a hard time, even if we don't verbalize this, thinking that there was something in the relationship or even in us that they didn't give us what we needed, especially
Mm,
when we see them behave in the way that we desire with other people. So it
sure.
demonstrates they have capacity. And so we internalize that we weren't good enough, right?
Mm,
Which creates a different type of wounding, which we have to grieve. And so these are, um, in some ways, ambiguous losses because
yes.
there's not a concrete nature to it, right? Because especially when no one has died, right? It doesn't it no one's rallying around you and saying, let me bring you food and let's have an honoring ritual when your mother is alive, but you're saying she's toxic, so I can't have her in my life, right? No one does any grieving or honoring, right? We don't have any holidays or support groups. Really, we do have a few support groups, not enough, right, to honor
Right.
those types of losses. And so they're ambiguous, right, to
Mm,
that degree. And then there's the anticipatory grief that we might experience when someone is at their end of life, or my grandmother has dementia, right?
yeah.
And so I have grieved the loss of her nurturing spirit, her ability to share her recipes or just have in a present day conversation, because dementia robs you of that, right? So her
Absolutely.
personality is different. And so I had to grieve that our relationship had to change as a result of that. I became a caregiver to someone who was my caregiver, right? And so that was a loss that I had to, to figure out. And the reality is that she has more days behind her than there are ahead of her. And so that's some anticipatory grief that I know I deal with on a regular basis, because I know that at some point she's not going to physically be here,
Yeah.
right? And so that anticipation of loss, which can occur with symbolic losses as well, right? We might anticipate the end of a friendship. We might be anticipating that our job is coming to a close. All of those trigger losses in the grief process for us,
Mm,
that we often don't have room to either name or to actually grieve, because we have to get back to, survival or making ends meet or reclaiming peace, right? If this is a toxic relationship. Um, and people give us a hard time around holding boundaries, right?
really?
Boundaries really get a bad rap. Boundaries often make us feel like we are denying people who are important to us access to
Yes.
us. And to some degree, you are. That is exactly what you're doing. You're conserving your resources with respect to time,
Mm-hmm.
energy, your
Mm-hmm.
mental wellness, but
Yes.
you are doing it in service to you,
Yes.
right? Um, I always say that the folks who benefit, that do not, that get a rub, right, or don't appreciate your boundaries are the ones who benefit from you not having any, right? And so to really evaluate that,
Yes.
because boundaries are very effective, right? Um, and so those are just things that kind of show up on this journey that I think um, many of us have been conditioned to kind of set aside when it comes to kind of
Yes.
our own grief in that way.
Yes. Thank you for that. And I do want to kind of speak a little bit. I'm trying to get them all in there. I do want to speak a little bit. You mentioned, a parent, having a parent that was incarcerated, or perhaps
Mhm.
not, maybe not even incarcerated, but maybe they are someplace like the military or something like that, where they're gone for copious amounts of time, and they're not going to come back. Can you
Mhm.
share a little bit about that? The idea that they're there, but you don't have access to them. Would that show up in the same
Yeah,
way as sort of the ambiguous loss of,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely, because no one's died, right? They're not, but they're just not available. And so again, we are talking about that grief and gap that I mentioned earlier. And
Mm,
so yes, we understand. We might even be able to understand why they are not available, right? If it's because of their job or whatever. And we even can feel guilty because they're a way
mm-hmm.
to provide to some degree, right?
Yes.
They're a way to create opportunity. They might be when my kids are really young, my daughter in particular, I was in my doc program. And so it's one of the motivations for me to finish as soon as I did, right? Was because I knew that she was paying the cost of me working, right? And being gone and being an externship. And, I joked one year that when I was in my clinicals that my nanny one, made more money than I did because of all the time she had my kid, right? And two, that I was so thankful because she was in a surrogate mother role. And that was really hard for me to grapple with, but it also, I knew that it was also temporary. And I, made a commitment to my
Mm,
daughter that that would be, it was a sacrifice that she was inheriting as
sure.
well, right? And oftentimes I think that we may not think about that component, or we may not have the room to think about it because we might be the only provider, right? The only one that can kind of do that work. But here's the other piece, right? It's for many of us who are, I call myself a first generation parent to some degree. And although I've had parenting, I'm the first one in my kind of immediate family to be parenting not from my trauma. And I got amazing parenting, but I didn't get all of what I needed. And no one ever does, right? But my grandmother parented based on the way that she was parented. And so
Mm,
she's very kind of strict, and was very much about preparing us, and was not as nurturing as I needed her to be as a young child. She's evolved in that prior to the
mm-hmm.
dementia to be more nurturing, but as a kid, I didn't get that. And when my mother was incarcerated, obviously that wasn't available in the same way.
Yes.
Although post incarceration, that's her natural way of being, right? She also happens to be a substance abuse counselor, and so
Yeah.
gets it in a very different way.
Yes.
But again, I was about 11 at the time, right? And so that was still a gap that you just can't go back and be like, oh, let me fill this cup because it was empty, right? Or let me fill this cup.
Yes.
It doesn't replace the previous years. And so for me, my kids don't have that experience. And so I often know that I'm parenting from a place of both deficit and abundance. So I'm parenting from a place of what I didn't get that I know I needed, but also wanting to parent based on what my kids need, because they don't need what I needed as a kid, right? They're not exposed to the same things I was exposed to as a kid. They don't have a trauma history that is intergenerational the way that I did as a
Yes.
kid, right? They have their own traumas as being, Black and brown children in this world, but it's not family based.
Yes.
It's not, inherited trauma. And so I know that some of my parenting is, I'm learning for the first time, where some of us, we parent based on, we have an example or an experience of how our parents handled that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in many of the conversations I find myself having with my kids, I'm like, well, they never talked to me about the birds and the bees, right? The conversation was don't have sex and don't get pregnant. It was never about what your body's doing and how to be safe, and
Yes.
let's make sure if you're asked questions, right? And so for me, that's not parenting from experience that I received. It's parenting based on the knowledge. And so I'm so thankful to have a community. And in grief, we grieve with a community. We grieve with folks who companion with us, even as I grieve the lessons I'm learning for the first time as a parent, because I didn't have a guide, right, in the ways that I know I need in order to parent based on the abundance, and not reperpetuating the trauma. So I rely on my community, right, who helps me with sharing their own experiences and how they parent and those things, so my kids benefit, right? And I think this
Yeah.
is the same thing that happens, um, is that gap that some of us are never able to close because we don't have community, or because we haven't been able to figure out or to have space where we're able to understand that they, one, probably we're doing the best that they can, and two, it
Yes.
doesn't mean that it's what we needed, right? That those two can exist side by side and both be true,
Yes.
right?
I would agree with you there. Um, One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was social media etiquette around grieving. You brought that up
Mm.
also. Can you share a little bit about that? Because there's a lot of times when people post, oh, so and so has passed, or even, my husband and I have divorced, or kind of just things that they'll post, and then they'll say, well, kind of respect our privacy type of thing. Or even mega stars will say, oh, we've decided to do this uncoupling, please respect our privacy, blah 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 blah. Can you talk a little bit more about social media, and maybe even, I guess that would fall in the
Mm.
arena of public etiquette as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, especially in, we're right on the back end of Chadwick Boseman dying, and I've been seeing some interesting posts about how his camp and his squad kept his his very private battle with colon cancer private. And people are really praising this. And I think, great, it does deserve praise, but part of the reason that we're amplifying that is because we have become so used to having access to all of people's information that privacy seems to be the exception, right, and not the norm. And this is also true with social media when we are talking about the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a public figure, or just whether it's death or not, right? Because we know that divorce and separation, there's a variety of different losses or transitions that we might experience in our life that we feel the need to share publicly for whatever reason, right? The challenge is that because we have, I think, such a disregard, or to some degree an entitlement to know people's very private information, when they don't share it, we go and seek it, right? Or we might even think that we're being considerate by saying, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, what happened? And it's like, well, in the midst of their grief, that's actually a very invasive and inconsiderate question, because it actually doesn't, at this point, it doesn't matter to the family. The circumstances might complicate the grief, but knowing the circumstances almost never really alleviates the suffering, right? I mean, ideally, we might ask questions as the family or as the loved one or whomever's actually involved. We ask those questions because we're attempting to make meaning. But the folks who are kind of on the peripheral, you don't get to trump the family's grief process because of your need to know. It is very invasive, where people say things that are, again, well-intentioned, like, well, you know, he's no longer suffering, or he's in a better place. Well, you don't, the family doesn't feel that way in that moment, right? I wanted my brother still here with me, right? And although I have come to a place of being able to understand that he really was suffering, and my beliefs, my personal beliefs about what happens when you die gives me some comfort, but you can't impose that on other people. That may not be what they believe. But in the immediate aftermath, I felt very abandoned by God. And so you telling me that he was in a better place and he wasn't suffering only made me mad, right? And you likely got you blocked because it wasn't, it just was inappropriate, right? And again, it imposes, it's well-intentioned, again, not helpful in those moments, unless the family has specifically expressed that that is in alignment with their beliefs, and then affirm it, fine. But absent of that, it is very, it's just inappropriate, and it can be very wounding to those who are grieving.
Yeah, and I agree with you, but I think that sometimes, and I've not even like, absent from that list, but I think that, sometimes when people hear, or like when something is like, oh my God, what happened? It's like a shock. I feel like what happened is either the first or second question.
It is.
From most people. Like, that's just like a kick in the gut. What happened?
Unbelievable. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Right, because it's unbelievable. It's like,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, this person was so young, or oh my gosh, you guys always look so happy. Yeah, or I just talked to them. So I feel like there's a part of that that's just like human nature to see, like, I want to know, like, what happened. And it may come across as disrespectful, but also too, I think it's natural human curiosity. So with that being said, what do you recommend for that piece that's
So
that natural human, like, for those people that just have that?
Yes, it's to just slow yourself down, right? Because eventually you are likely going to find that information out. But when they haven't even buried the person, the divorce, the ink on the divorce degree is not even, it hasn't even dried yet. Give people room to be where they are. They're navigating a life transition, and your questions are probably overwhelming. I remember when my brother died and the news covered the story, we were still trying to figure out what happened. All of our my other brother found out on Facebook, right? Because people were tagging his page. And so we didn't even have room, just as a family, to just acknowledge the reality of what happened before we were immediately slammed with media requests for for interviews, right? And the last thing I wanted to do was talk to anyone in the media, right? Or they initially, posted a story that was inaccurate, all the comments underneath the story, like, it was just a lot. And I didn't have any escape from it, right? Because I was probably the most public person related to him. And so I was inundated, right? And many of us use social media as a way to connect and engage and to
Yes.
escape, to be
Yes.
quite honest.
Yeah.
And so I was inundated in real life with, I planned the funeral. I'm the grief therapist in the family. So what do you think happens when something happens? Is everyone's like, well, Ajita, what are we doing? Like, what's happening, right?
Yes.
Make so that was happening. And then on social media, I had my notifications were in absolute shambles because of all the people who were tagging. Again, they're well intentioned, but to think about on the other end, to slow yourself down and say, how is the family feeling, and follow their lead, right? And so I had to make a post that said, we thank you so much for your wonderful words and your offers of help and those things, but we're going to ask that you please not tag my mother in posts. It's perfectly fine if you post on my brother's page, but please just stop tagging her, because she couldn't do the thing. Like mindlessly scroll memes on Facebook was a pastime that, disconnected her from the day-to-day things that,
Mm.
she'd have hundreds of notifications. Now, after the fact, when I say the memorial, or the anniversary of his loss, or our first holidays, it was so beautiful to see the outpouring of love. We were in a place in our grief where we could appreciate what had happened in the immediate aftermath from
Sure.
all of the people that loved him. It was just overwhelming in that moment. And so I ask anyone that's companioning or witnessing, or connected in any way, to just give room and to give grace, and to follow the family's lead in that regard. And it's okay if maybe you all have mutual friends, for you all to have those conversations. But if you're not close enough to the family where you already know, it's probably not need to know information for you in that moment.
Hmm.
And so I would just encourage anyone to just to just pause, right? And to just give some room for the family to figure out how to get their feet underneath them again.
Fair enough.
Um,
In the interest of time, I have two more like questions. One is, if we're grieving, you talked about the different types of loss, right? Ambiguous, disenfranchised, physical, emotional, all those different types of losses. And I know that there's more that we didn't get into today. But my first question would be, how do you grieve? Because I feel like a lot of people feel like they should be grieving a certain way. And I know that there's no right or wrong way, but like, what is the best way, in your opinion, or what are some of the things that help people grieve in a more healthy way? And
mhm.
secondly, my second question that kind of goes along with that is, if you see someone or if you know someone who's going through loss, outside of giving pause, how can you support that person?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. So the first one, like, grief is universal, but your experience and expression is unique to you. And so I think one of the most important pieces is, to give yourself permission to grieve in a way that honors
Mm-hmm.
the loss that you were experiencing, even when you have shared losses with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So give yourself that grace and give it to others, because we often evaluate how well we are grieving, or whether or not someone is grieving appropriately, based on what we're seeing. And so that is unique to you, right? And so some of us are more active in our grief. And so we often see this kind of generally with men. They will go back to work immediately, or they will do something like plant a tree, or they get busy, right? And for many, it is the way that they honor what was lost. For
Sure.
me, I went back to work, and my grandmother was confused, and my mom was like, it feels like it's too soon. I'm like, but you don't understand, right? I now became the primary financial caregiver for my grandmother, right? Um, and I feel very purposeful when I'm at work, and this makes me feel out of control.
Sure.
And so I went back to work, right? Um, and that was part of the way that I honor being able to bear witness, right, to others grieving, because I couldn't do anything else for my
Sure.
grandfather at that point. And so some people are more active in that way, and other people, it's not inactive, but it just, you don't see it in the behaviors, and so they're more emotionally expressive. And so these individuals, whether they're crying all the time or not, they're more just emotionally expressive, right? And so they might engage in honoring. And so I'm a bit of a mix of the two. And so I always celebrate, with different things. Like
Mm-hmm.
the 1st of September was the anniversary of my grandfather's death. I dedicated a book to him. We have a special dinner, which is his favorite. Those are just honoring rituals that we do. But before we can do any of those meaning making activities, we have to find a place, a way to accept the reality of what we have lost and the changes that are going to be evident in our life. And so a lot of us navigate anger and bargaining and just disbelief. And again, that's a natural part of the grief process,
Yes.
right? But we will find space. This is where, particularly when someone has died, identifying a way to keep the connection. And so for me, one of the big things that was important was my grandfather was really sick. He'd never even been inside of a gym in his life, right?
Wow.
Which I know would have helped his outcomes. And so one of the things that I promised to myself was that I would make dedicated time every single day to take care of me, right? That I would stop putting everyone before myself. That was something that was a gift that I had to find for myself. And it 100% aligned with the last thing that my grandfather said to me. And so for me, that's a way of honoring not only the way that he lived, but some of the things that influenced the way that he died. And so again, those are meaning making things. I also divorced that year, right? And so
Oh,
one of the
wow.
things that I had to do was to find a way to recenter myself in my life and to do it unapologetically. And so those are all, I mean, those are just different things, but we have to honor the fact that we have lost something, and what does our life look like after that? For many of us, it will never look like it did before. And so, how do you find a way to honor the loss and honor this life post loss in a way that allows you to reclaim your joy? And so, some of those things might include um, the time we give to ourselves, right? Some of us, I have clients who completely change their career because nothing like death wakes you up that to the fact that you're spending your life doing something you don't actually
Yes.
love, right? And it's not worth it. And so a ton of foundations have been created as a result of loss, whether it is for domestic violence or for Mothers Against Drugs and Alcohol,
Yes.
like all these different, the Susan G. Komen Foundation
Yes.
came as a result of loss. And so those are all ways that we make meaning. Um, Anyone that's kind of companioning with someone is listen to their stories. They need to tell them. The meaning making is in the stories, and in the way that they are able to rewrite the ends of that story, right? Because the ending is something that is actually not an ending, it's a new beginning. And so if we can have enough room to tell the stories where we've been, what we've experienced, how we're feeling, we will eventually be able to make room for where we're going. And that piece is important. Those who are companioning with folks, keep them grounded in the present moment and remind them that there's hope, there's something to look forward to, because in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of grief, especially cumulative losses, we often can't see our way outside of the present pain that is overwhelming. And so those are just things that folks can be a reminder for,
Mm.
and a reminder of. And I always tell my clients that I will hold the hope until it feels manageable for you. And so I hold it for them until they can reclaim it for themselves. And so sometimes we need those people that can see the other end when we cannot. Um,
Absolutely. Mm.
but be where they are, right?
Yes.
And I think the last piece that I'll add about that is to let go of this notion of time. Grief is not anchored by time. It is one of the biggest myths that actually does us a disservice. So we're on year
Yes.
3 of my grandfather's death. And every holiday, I feel the absence. Every milestone, I feel the absence. And so we kind of re-grieve, right? There's things that can re-trigger our grief process. But what generally happens if we have reached a place where we've actually made meaning in the aftermath of the loss is that the downtime, so to speak, to talk about the way that clients talk about it, right? We may go right back to denial. Like, I just cannot believe that, you know, I'm in this space in my life and they're not here, right? Every time something happens, whether it is amazing or crazy, my first inclination is to pick up the phone and call my grandpa because he was my person. Like, I talk to him every single day. So even though I know that he's not going to pick up on the other end, the habit of wanting to call him, like, I have to sit for a minute and like, okay, well, I know that based on my personal beliefs, I can just pray, right? Or I can be still and I can feel his presence. But those are my spiritual and religious beliefs. And so honor what your beliefs are about what happens in the aftermath and give yourself room to engage in that, right? And so I do a lot of meditation or walking um, pieces to allow me, and prayer to allow me to feel closer to my ancestors. And that's an important part of my grief process that is ongoing and lifelong, right? I often describe it as those who have ever held a newborn. They're really little and dainty. And so the way that we carry them is, we different. We hold them in the crux of our elbow a lot of times, or supporting their neck, right? So the way that we hold them is in a very particular way, right? But as that baby gets bigger, we adjust the way that we don't hold a toddler the same way we hold a newborn, right?
Yes.
We adjust our stance, right? Our muscle memory and capacity to hold a 6-pound newborn versus an 18-pound toddler, your body adjusts to that additional weight, right? And you learn almost immediately how to carry them. We usually pivot them to our side, or we carry them on our back or what have you, but your body adjusts to the change in that circumstances. And this is also what happens to the grief process, right? It doesn't go away. We just learn to hold it differently in a way that
Yes.
doesn't feel overwhelming.
Great. Thank you. I've learned so much during this interview, and I'm so happy that you came on to share with us. And I know that the listeners
Absolutely.
are going to be so excited once they hear this. How can people connect with you? How can people support you? Do you have things coming up in dealing with grief? Like, what are you
Do.
working on? Okay, tell us all about it.
Absolutely. So the book is live and available. And so
Okay.
the best place to connect with me is at ajitarobinson.com. I'm Dr. Ajita on Facebook and Dr. Ajita Robinson on Instagram. And so stay connected there. I also have a training that's coming up later in September, specifically for clinicians or those who are doing the companioning work around grief, so that we really can understand how to recognize it, but also how to assess it, because the way that we assess grief is different than other diagnoses that we might kind of ascribe, as well as how do we intervene. And so we're going to have a grief training on that to really give folks some skills. It'll be mirrored around the book, but we'll add some of the clinical components that we need if we're going to do this work. And so that's what's coming up next, that I think folks could benefit from.
Tell us the name of your book.
It's called The Gift of Grief,
Okay.
Navigating. Yeah, yeah. So it's a practical guide on navigating grief and loss. So it is written for the everyday person. It is not just for clinicians. And so anyone that is experiencing grief and loss, it will be an accessible read for.
And that's on Amazon, and I'll be sure to link that in the show notes. But you also have a course that goes along with the book, right?
I do. There is a free companion course that
Yeah.
goes along with the
Yeah.
book that provides some resources and some videos with me. I talk about a variety of different things. I also provide some handouts on social media statements, whether you're making it to the media or on behalf of your family. I have a
Nice.
grief kit for children who are
Nice.
navigating grief, so on and so forth. And so it is very robust, but it comes free when you purchase the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I'll be sure to post a link so that everyone can snap that right on up. And thank you so much for your time and explaining this, this process of grief, because I know it can be challenging for some, but I appreciate your thoughtful, words and consideration for everyone that may be going through this process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for all the work that you do.
Thank you. All right, so that was a great interview with Dr. Ajita. I really learned a lot from her, and I hope that you did too. Be sure to connect with us on social media, on A Date with Darkness on Instagram or Facebook, or send me an email and let me know how you felt about this podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform that you listen to the podcast. I really appreciate the positive reviews. I also appreciate you listening. So sharing is caring, and I appreciate everything that you get from this podcast and you sticking with me through the podcast. And of course, if you want to find a supportive free online community, please do join our Facebook group at A Date with Darkness on Facebook, and be sure to also follow us on Twitter. And until next time, be well and take care of yourself. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.